Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Elizabeth Weiss. She is the co-author of this book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past. Dr. Elizabeth Weiss completed her BA in anthropology from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1996 and earned her MA in anthropology from California State University, Sacramento in 1998. She holds a PhD from the University of Arkansas in environmental dynamics, an interdisciplinary program involving anthropology and the geosciences, which she completed in 2001. From 2002 to 2004, she was a postdoctoral research associate at the Canadian Museum of Civilization and began teaching at San Jose State University in 2004. Her other books include Reading the Bone, Activity, Biology, and Culture, and Paleopathology and Perspective, Bone Health and Disease Through Time. Okay, well, this is quite the podcast episode, in as much as about an hour into the conversation, a little more than an hour, I discovered that Elizabeth was once married to J. Philippe Rushton, the very controversial Canadian psychologist who has come back into the news recently because he got the support of Ed Wilson, who recently died. Anyway, this came about because Elizabeth and I were discussing her book and her work and her lawsuit against her university. She's suing the university for calling her a racist and shutting her out of the fossil collection that she has curated for the past 17 years. Why? Because she has been critical of the repatriation movement. If you're not familiar with this, this was a movement in the 1990s to return fossils of Native Americans, Native Americans. These are mostly fossils from many thousands of years ago, to the tribes currently living in the areas where the digs were made, and then reburying the finds. So she's critical of this because science is never complete, and if you bury the bones, then that's the end of the scientific study of migration patterns of Native Americans over the last 13 to 20,000 years ago, and who's related to who and how those migration patterns developed throughout North and South America, and so on and so forth. And the science is always moving along and developing, and if you bury the bones, that ends that. Plus, there's a certain amount of Native American creationism in archaeology now, in which, because of the horrific history of the United States government treatment of Native Americans over the centuries, there's a movement to show respect and make amends and so forth, which is totally understandable. Everybody wants to do that now, including me. But when the Native American myth, which some of the stories are that there is no migration from Siberia over the ice bridge down the ice corridor and so forth. They've always been here. Well, that's just not true. So to the extent that it interferes with scientific understanding of human evolution, well, she pushes back against that, as would I. Anyway, so we get into all that, including these horror stories of how she's been treated, not just by her university, but by her fellow archaeologists who are very progressive, very woke, and will brook no discussion of this repatriation movement. It is set in stone, and there is very little room for debate. So she is outcast. Anyway, so you'll get all of that, but then I wanted to pull back and talk about the larger cancel culture, of which she is now a victim, and I brought up Ed Wilson and the attacks on him the moment he was dead. Of course, since he can't defend himself, always suspect when people do that. And there's been this discovery of a tranche of letters that Wilson wrote privately to J. Philippe Rushton, who had this theory back in the 1990s about R selection and K selection. R selected species breed very rapidly, have lots of offspring, and don't allocate many resources to any one of them, in hopes that, by law of large numbers, some will get into the next generation, as opposed to K-selected species, which have fewer offspring and allocate more resources to them to get the handful into the next generation. Anyway, that's the theory, and he applies it to human groups, blacks, whites, and Asians, and makes this. I remember at the time thinking, this is an insane theory. It sure sounds racist to me and to pretty much everybody that heard it at the time, that, black groups are more promiscuous, have more babies, allocate fewer resources, whites in the middle, Asians at the top. And then he sort of coordinated that with race IQ differences, and he even had some element of penis size, blacks the largest, whites in the middle, and Asians the smallest. And somehow that was related to promiscuity and sexual selection. And I don't know what, I forget the details of that. But in the middle of my kind of recounting this for her, in case she had never heard of J. Philippe Rushton, and for our listeners, she blurts out, well, I was married to him, so I know the theory quite well. So like, whoa, what? And so that took us down a different path, in which I just asked her point blank, okay, this guy was a racist, right? Is that why you got divorced? I mean, he was just a racist asshole, and who wants to live with somebody who's like that? No, absolutely not the case. So that was quite the surprise, and I pushed her on it, as you'll hear, and you'll see the surprise in my face. But I pushed her, and after a few drinks, maybe he blurts out something about, blacks or this or that, Asians. No. Mm-mm. So it could be entirely possible that he really just wanted to pursue this particular line of research, and he took Wilson's theory of R selection, K selection, and applied it to human groups. This has since been pretty thoroughly debunked, as far as I know, scientifically. But that isn't the point. The point is, well, you have to be a racist to pursue that. It appears that he was more of just a contrarian. According to Elizabeth, as you'll hear, it was just that he kind of enjoyed poking the hornet's nest and seeing what comes up. And some people do that. And then the more you push back against him, you try to cancel him, then the more he's going to dig his heels in. This is her interpretation of him. I'm since writing some of this up, and I've had similar descriptions of Rushton from other people. Who knows what's in somebody's heart, but you would think if anybody would know, it would be his spouse. And to add a parenthetical to that, their marriage did not end well. It was very unamicable. He's dead. So there'd be no reason for her to, just cover up his tracks and to protect him or defend him. No, in fact, if anything, as we know, spouses tend to disparage each other when divorces are unamicable. She would be motivated to say what's really going on in his heart if he was a racist, but that's not the case in this case. So anyway, that made this a rather different and interesting conversation, I must say. So we cover all that and much more. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And if you appreciate the podcast, please give us some support at skeptic.com/donate. That is the podcast is supported by the Skeptic Society primarily, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit, so your donations there are appreciated. All right, thanks for listening, and here's the show. Today's episode is brought to you by Wondrium, the former Great Courses teaching company, now expanding their horizons with a subscription service where you can stream content online and listen to just an endless supply of courses, contents, films, and various sundry learning products that they've now expanded their horizons to. And as you know, I've produced a couple of these courses for them. I love this company, and they support the podcast, so we really appreciate their business. So I'd like to give you this offer that they have made for my listeners. If you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, WONDRIUM.com/SHERMER, Shermer, you get a 22-day free trial. It's great. Why would you not want to take advantage of that free content for almost more than 3 weeks, almost a month? Worth trying. And why wouldn't you try it? And why wouldn't you subscribe? I certainly have for about 30 years now to this company. And for example, here's a course I'm going to take in the coming weeks, The Great Revolutions in Modern History. I'm trying to expand the horizons, by the way, of this podcast to include more history, philosophy, politics, economics, and so on, not just science. What makes a revolution? Who makes a revolution? Nationalism as revolutionary ideologies. the man who lost in the Russian Revolution. Probably Trotsky. Totalitarianism and Counter-Revolution, the U.S. Civil Rights Revolution, England's Glorious Revolution, Samuel Adams, Apostle of American Liberty, the French Revolution, Women's Revolution for Rights, the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, the Countercultural Revolution, terrorism as revolutionary strategy, a bad strategy, but there it is. The Revolutionary Year of 1989, that was a big year. And the last lecture in this course, the TV revolution in your living room. Yes, we can watch it unfold on live TV or on your computer. Anyway, that's the kind of content that's available. It's so rich. It's so good. And we're so lucky to have them supporting the podcast because this is the kind of thing we do. So if you like that, you want to give it a shot, again, go to wondrium.com/Shermer and get your 22-day free trial. And at the end of that, subscribe. It's a great, great company, a great resource for knowledge. All right. Thanks for listening. And here's our episode. Elizabeth Weiss, nice to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are in the teeth of some serious controversy here, I see, which I'm very interested in following a little bit. I'm a longtime kind of amateur archaeology buff. I just love to kind of follow along the controversies. I do remember some of the repatriation issues back in the 90s, I think, with the Kennewack man. So we'll get into all that in a minute. But you're suing your university and for calling you a racist and shutting you off from your data set, your fossil collection that you curate. So, but before we get into all that, just to kind of just to tease the readers there, the listeners, that this is going to be epic. Give us some background. What's your origin story, since you study ancient history? Where were you born and raised, and what's your training, and how'd you get interested in archaeology?
So basically, I was born in San Francisco, and although my father's retired Army, so we moved around a lot, moving around every about 3 years or so. When my father retired, he retired to San Francisco, and I finished up my high school years there and at Washington High, and then I went to UC Santa Cruz for my undergraduate, and I was mainly attracted to UC Santa Cruz because of its beautiful surroundings and nature. I love being outdoors in nature, and the deer, and you'd walk to class and there'd be deer around, and walk at night and see owls, but that's where I really started with physical anthropology as well, with kind of more of an interest in the human evolution aspect. I was fascinated with why we became human, and so I focused my attention on human evolution. And when I graduated from Santa Cruz, my last year in Santa Cruz, I actually spent in Egypt, and so I did a year abroad in Egypt. And before I came back, I spent 2 months about in Kenya for field school at the Kubifora Field School. And one of the things was that I realized that I still love the outdoors and the heat and so forth, but that one of the slightly disappointing things was that fossils are so darn hard to find, right? So we found a few little teeth during the field school, but what really sparked my interest during that time was we excavated a 5,000-year-old burial site, and it was so interesting and fun because there was so much to discover. So there were skeletal remains, there were artifacts, and after weeks of not finding anything, this was exciting. So I came back to the States, and I went to Sacramento State, which is one of the CSUs, one of the California State Universities, for my master's under my advisor, Professor Beth Strasser. And she was, her expertise was in mobility and movement. and that fit along my lines of the interest of why we became bipedal. And even as a child, I was very interested in anatomy. So this skeletal anatomy aspect of all that really appealed to me. And I did my master's on a Native American collection that looked at differences between males and females and how mobile they were by looking at the cross sections of the femurs. This led me to my PhD work, which was a continuation but looking at arm bones. And I did my PhD at the University of Arkansas, and when I was doing my PhD, Kennewick Man had just been handed over to the group of government-chosen scientists to study him before they decide whether everybody can study him, right? So Kennewick Man had been absconded away, and nobody can study him until we figure out what's going on. And then the government chose like a dozen people to study him. One of those people was Jerry Rose, who was one of my advisors at University of Arkansas. And he said, why don't you look at the cross sections of Kennewick Man? And so I did. And I did some little research on that. But what
does that mean, cross-section?
Cross-sectional analyses, like CT scans of the leg bones. And Kennewick Man's leg bones are quite interesting in that they're really robust. They look more like an Ice Age man's leg bones than a Holocene, like 10,000 years after, leg bones. And considering that he was also likely fairly old for that time period in his 40s, that this was quite interesting that he had these really robust, strong leg bones that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in such a young antiquity, right? So after the Ice Age, but old individual.
Okay, so just to put it in perspective, that's about 10,000 years old or 11,000 or something.
Kennewick Man is about 9,000, yeah. 9,000 years. And the Ice Age ended around 10,000 or 11,000, So we get the Holocene.
Yeah. And so the oddity is that you would expect somebody to have robust leg bones because they walk a lot. The environment is more physically stressful, which is what you'd see in an Ice Age, but not so much post-Ice Age?
Right. The combination, both, hard walking in the environment, but also it appears that something happened with genetically that led to more gracile people, even fairly late in our evolution. So if you look at Neanderthals, they were far more robust than Homo sapiens sapiens. But even ourselves are less robust than early Homo sapiens. And that happened around the Ice Age. So it's partly activity, but it's also partly the genetics of what makes a robust individual. So it's a little bit of both, right? So, but what happened is when I was doing this, that really kind of seeing all the controversy about reburial and repatriation really started to concern me. And one of my first peer-reviewed articles was on Kennewick Man's the repatriation or the attempted repatriation and reburial at that time of Kennewick Man and the whole controversy of it. And that was in 2001 that I wrote about the problems of reburial of Paleo-Indians being those dating over 7,000 years. So that's where I kind of got picked up on my concern about the repatriation laws. NAGPRA was passed, and NAGPRA is Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. NAGPRA was passed in 1990, but for a few years, it didn't have much impact on the field, and it really, really took off a few years later. And I think that by 2001, there was wider concern than had there been originally. I think when NAGPRA was first proposed, a lot of people were for it because they thought this was going to be a compromise. But as it got passed and as the evidence showed that there would be a lot of skeletal remains that were not affiliated with modern tribes, rules changed. Things became more lenient for repatriation, and then concerns started to arise. So after my PhD, I did a postdoc at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and then I got my job at San Jose State University in 2004.
Right. And so you've been the curator of this collection of, what's the right term, Native American fossils or Paleo American fossils, or what's the?
I would say it's a Native American skeletal collection. So they are,
all right.
The range is like 5,000 to 800 years ago.
Right. And the latest we have of the migration into North America, what would be the earliest accepted date? Let's call it a consensus amongst archaeologists of the first humans to migrate into North America. What's the consensus at the moment?
I would say probably around 13,000 years ago. Some people push it all the way back to 22,000, but I've never seen anything that's really reliable that dates past 22,000. So there's a lot of debate, obviously, about the dates. And there's the Clovis people and the pre-Clovis people, and there's even what path they took. Right? It was across the Bering Strait, or was there the Pacific Kelp Highway? I suspect that there were multiple migrations. I think there's clear evidence that there were not just one migration. And I would say the biggest migrations probably started around 13,000 years ago, and maybe there were some earlier ones. But that's what I think that everybody can agree on. Yes, around that time they were definitely coming over.
Yeah, my connection to all this is, in Skeptic, we've dealt a lot with alternative archaeology, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is quite varied. That of course Columbus wasn't the first to discover America, but maybe it was the Vikings, or maybe it was the lost tribe of Israel, or maybe it was the Egyptians or the Phoenicians, and based on little artifacts here and there that people find, and then there's the kind of migration across the Siberian Strait there, and so the further back you go, the kind of more alternative it becomes. Yeah. I'm just looking in my book for a quote from Jared Diamond when I was engaging with Graham Hancock, who you probably know, who is I find to be a really interesting, thoughtful, great writer, smart guy who kind of dives into your field. And he's pushing this idea that there's a extremely ancient, advanced civilization, possibly even in North America, that goes back way before maybe even 22,000, maybe 30,000 or 40,000 years ago. And right before, let's see, let me find this quote from Jared Diamond, which he said something about, right before I went on Joe Rogan's podcast with Graham, excuse me, I'm kind of rambling here, but let me get focused, that there was this discovery in San Diego of a mammoth bones at a construction site, and the mammoth bones date like 130,000 years ago, and there were some rocks that looked like they might have been chipped stone tools, but maybe not. Maybe they're just kind of accidentally chipped. And it's a signal detection problem, right? And right. You can't quite make out, what you're looking at. And then the bones were broken in a way that in this paper in Nature, published in Nature, I'm sure you remember this, where the long bones were broken in the lengthways instead of this way, the cross section way, which is the kind of thing you do if you want to get the marrow out, which is something humans might do with one of these stone tools. Well, if this was true, then that would make it an order of magnitude older than what you just said, 13,000 to say 20,000. So of course Graham is like, aha, you see, here's a signal. This is it. People have been here a lot longer. Could even be Neanderthals. Who knows who it is, right? So I called my friend Jared Diamond and said, all right, what's the latest on this? And he said, this is like the latest version with a half-life of 2 weeks of pre-Clovis. And he's heard 100 of these in the last 50 years, right? And there's much excitement. And again, this isn't like Ancient Aliens TV show. This is published in Nature, a real study. And he said, yes, that's right. Well, but what happens with these studies? If there's no replication, there's additional fossils found. If fossils are in San Diego at 130,000 years, there should be a bunch up here in Santa Barbara, up your way in San Francisco, up north in Oregon, Seattle, all the way up in Atlanta. There should be hundreds of these, that are kind of tracing that age pattern, but there aren't. So what do you do with that? And so what do you do? What do archaeologists and scientists do with an anomaly like that?
Well, we tried to explain why there is an anomaly, but also we look for patterns, right? So as you said, if it's a one-off, it might just be wrong. It could be that the bones split from weathering. It could be that it was trampled on. It could be all sorts of things. But I think that this is one of the reasons why it's so important to keep collections, whether they are mammoth collections and artifacts or skeletal collections, and not to repatriate them or rebury them or close the museums, because the only way to negate these things is to basically restudy them. And so one of the things that some of the things that run through my head that have been misunderstood in the past, for example, is when anthropologists first started looking at human skeletal remains of northern populations like Alaska, like the very northern part of British Columbia, Greenland, like the Aleut, Inuit, and the Eskimo. When they first started looking at those populations, the anthropologists were like, where are the females? They thought that these collections were pretty much all males because they were so robust. The arm bones and so forth looked so like big boned, and the markers from the muscles looked so robust that they didn't think that these were females. And then, years down the road, restudying them, they're like, we have new methods to look at whether something's a male or female, with different traits on the pelvis or the skull, that we realize, oh, actually, those first studies were wrong. And for no reason except that, we didn't know yet all the ways to determine sex. And so I think that whether it's a case like that with the Aleut and the Eskimo and the Inuit, or a case like this mammoth bone, the best way to correct fallacies is to keep the data around so they can be reanalyzed. And I think and if they're not replicated, and you never see something about that study again, then it probably is because it was wrong. So I know that
to their credit, Nature published a rebuttal, a follow-up, in which a group of scientists said the bone breakages are probably due to the heavy equipment. It was a construction site, rolling over this whatever it was, a graveyard of mostly elephant bones, and it wasn't humans at all. It was just a byproduct. So I guess you must have to deal with that when you uncover fossils for the first time. But let's just touch on the legal aspect. Who owns fossils? So, for example, where I live here, Santa Barbara, I'm up in the mountains above Santa Barbara, and there's some Chumash cave paintings up here, or just rock art, really, not cave paintings, rock art. And when I bought this house up on West Camino Cielo, they go, oh, there's some rock art on your property. I'm like, ooh, how cool is that? Chumash Indian rock art on my property. Turns out it wasn't on my property, which I found out when I hiked down there, and the neighbor goes, hey, this is my property. I'm like, oh, okay, sorry. But really, I mean, these houses and the road that comes up here, this is all cut in the 1960s, Before that, no one lived up here. The Chumash rock art belong to, I don't know, nobody, or to nature, or to the Chumash, or I don't know what. I have no idea what the legal aspects of that are. If I find a fossil, gravesite on my property and it's Chumash Indians, do I own it? Does the state of California own it? Does the Chumash tribe that lives around here? They have a casino up in Santa Ynez. I mean, do they own it?
Well,
how does that work?
well, basically, the repatriation and reburial laws cover federal land and institutions that take federal monies. So if it's private property, it's not. It doesn't fall under the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act or the California laws. Now there are some laws about burials, and like obviously you can't like bury your spouse in your backyard. There are certain laws about burials and about
What?
yeah, who would have guessed, right? But so one of the things is that some privately owned land that have excavations going, those remains are safe as long as those remains are not put in a institute in a museum that takes federal money. Now this has been a huge complication with the COVID, because a lot of private museums took federal stimulus money, and now they fall under NAGPRA, where they didn't before. And so I suspect that this is going to have a huge fallout, and that there's going to be some deep regret about having taken that money.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a new wrinkle. I hadn't heard that. Yeah, so let's say I find a burial ground of fossils that are obviously ancient, and I donate them. I own them, but I donate them to UC Santa Barbara Archaeology Department. Now that brings them under the umbrella of that law, right?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And so, if I found skeletal remains on my property, I would not be donating them. I would,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, maybe I'd donate them to a private
Why?
owner, but
Oh,
but I
because
would
you're
not.
concerned about this interruption of the scientific study of it.
Right. I would assume that they would be reburied. And I'm, some people, have very, have asked me like, where does it end? At what point do I think that remains should definitely be reburied, and at what point, should they definitely not be reburied? I would say on the side of not reburial. Most of the collections in the U.S., most of the collections are salvage sites, that meaning that they were discovered like the mammoth, right, from during construction. And so the option was to either bulldoze over this stuff and ruin the collections, destroy the bones, or to excavate them, and the skeletal remains were excavated. So salvage sites, most of them are pre-contact, and so most tribes, modern tribes, have not been around that long. I think the oldest one, which I think is the Pecos Pueblo tribe in New Mexico, has maybe a 2,000 year longevity. So can be linked for 2,000 years back, with certain cultural aspects and so forth. But I think that that's the oldest one. So if you're looking at skeletal remains that are 3,000 years old, there's no association with any tribe. They are Native American in the term of they were here, they're native to the land, but they're not really. You can't say that 5,000-year-old remain is Navajo or is right. So, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people think that DNA solves this issue, and DNA does not solve the issue, because DNA will tell you who you are biologically related to, but but it won't tell you what specific tribe you the remains belong to, for three reasons. One is that the tribes change and they're not that old. Two is that not every tribe has different biological markers or genetic markers, right? So you might be able to test my DNA and say, oh, I have ancestry from Europe, but could you narrow it down to what city in Germany or what city in Romania? No, right? So without having specific relatives. And so it's different to think about like tying together people who are actually related, like mother and father, like forensic anthropologists, versus just looking at broad population genetics, which is what they do, which is great for understanding the past migration patterns, who's related to, but is not great to understand what tribe is most closely related to what remains, because it's kind of an artificial, these are artificial lines.
Right. So let's say people came down the coast. This is what I think is probably what happened. Because it's a lot easier to take boats down the coast and it goes much faster than it is to walk through glacier fields, particularly if they came here before the that ice corridor was opened up, which is what it looks like. Because there was that find in New Mexico a couple months ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was, I think that was 23,000 years old.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but it was surprisingly old. So it'll be interesting to see if that gets replicated and corroborated by additional finds. But anyway, the point is that so there's some Chumash cave paintings up here on called Painted Caves, famous road up here in Santa Barbara. But there's no date on them, and the people I've talked to said, well, maybe a few centuries at most, maybe 1,500 years old. Okay, so there were probably people living here 8,500 years ago. Out there on the Channel Islands, apparently there's some sites that are like 11,000 or 12,000 years old. Okay, well, so if you find, so who owns those paintings? Who owns the bones out there or the artifacts or whatever? It can't be the current Chumash Indians because they just don't tribe up here and they just don't go back that old. That's your point, right?
That's my point, yes. But according, due to the political environment in archaeology, now they would say that I'm wrong and that they do own it, or that even if they don't own it, they should own it. And the Native American...
And what's the argument for that?
The Native American argument is we've always been here. So pretty much everything that's found on this land must be related to some of us because we've always been here. And they're really basing it on creation myths. And I think it's interesting that a lot of them have similar creation myths, which is not that surprising because they're similar to our own creation myths, to Western creation myths. It's basically, that there's a superior being that created man and woman, and that therefore there's no migration because we were made here kind of argument. And even NAGPRA committee members, two of which must be religious tribal leaders of Indian religions, traditional Indian religions, have said, we didn't come over no land bridge. We didn't come across any, from any other place. We've always been here. We evolved here. We were created here. And so they don't accept the concept of migration. One of the other aspects is that many of them believe in poly origins, or basically that different tribes were created and in different events, that so this tribe has no relation to this, and more importantly that their tribe is not at all related to anyone who came who's from the old world, for example. So um, this is really a religious argument and does not belong in science. And yet it has just um, been accepted. And I don't think it would be accepted if we were saying it from the Christian perspective. Um, and when I gave my talk at the Society for American Archaeology last year, that was my main point, is that, we shouldn't be using creation myths to um, make repatriation decisions. Whether somebody is for repatriation or not, creation myths don't belong in the decision making process. And for that talk, I was basically, called every nasty thing that that you can think of, but also they basically deplatformed my talk, took it off of the website. It was supposed to be maintained on the website for, I think, 2 or 3 months, and it was played once. Was a pre-record. It was played once when the original time slot, and then it was taken down. And they basically told me it was, the society issued an apology for the harm it caused, and my argument was really very basic, that that repatriation decisions do not should not be made on creation myths, and that is considered controversial, which I don't understand.
Yeah, obviously I agree with you because I've been dealing with creationists my entire career. And I believe that the creationists I've engaged with believe what they are saying. This is what we believe. We believe that when the Bible says this, this is what it means, and we believe it. Or if they're a little more sophisticated, intelligent design creationists, they believe that, there is some kind of a designer out there that jiggered the knobs to make life come out complex and so on and so forth. But most scientists, of course, reject that, and they wouldn't base decisions grounded in science on anything remotely like that. They wouldn't. And so I wonder, do your fellow archaeologists really believe that a Native American creation myth has equal epistemic standing with a scientific Darwinian evolutionary, connectedness, migration hypothesis, and so forth? Do they really believe that, or is it more of a mythic belief, or a political belief? Like, we know this is nonsense, but we feel so bad the way Native Americans were treated over the centuries that we feel we need to do something to make up
I
for that. And this is what we're going to do.
I think it's partly that guilt. I do think that there's a lot of, we feel so bad. I think there is also um, a kind of well, it's not quite the same. These people are special. They do have oral histories that go back centuries, and accepting that there's something special about this, which it really isn't. And, there's a whole area of archaeology called indigenous archaeology, and trying to work in, indigenous knowledge into archaeological research. And, some of that knowledge might be about plants that are used. And of course, every culture is going to have certain indigenous or folk or, traditions. Sometimes they're going to get it right. And if you want to test that scientifically, that's fine. But because of the guilt, I think that they can't test it objectively, because if they find out that it's wrong, that's going to make them feel even guiltier. But I think there's a lot of just we don't want to harm anybody. We don't want to, so we must accept their, and I'll say demands. I mean, some of the demands, I think are straight out sexist, like demands that females can't touch warrior remains, or that females in archaeological digs, when they're having their menstrual cycle, have to be isolated and can't be on site and can't eat with the group. These are crazy demands that we would not accept from other people. And I think that it's harmful to accept them from anybody.
You mean you, a female archaeologist? If okay, I don't even. It's embarrassing to even say it. If you're on your period and you're at a site, you can't go there, or you can't
There
sit
are
amongst the other natives, or
there are tribes that, for example, UC Berkeley has worked with tribes and other universities that have all sorts of menstrual rituals that include things like if a woman is menstruating, she cannot excavate with others. She cannot eat with others. She has to eat alone. Um, sh you cannot wash the dishes of someone who's menstruating and someone who's not menstruating in the same group. They have to be separated. I mean, I think this is crazy. I think it's
okay,
discriminatory.
okay,
And
this is crazy. Yes, of course it is. And your fellow, let's say, far left progressive archaeologist colleagues, if it wasn't Native Americans telling you this, it was, I don't know, some Christian group, they'd be outraged, right?
they would be outraged. Yes. Yeah. And so I think that there's this combination
So
of
here, this ideology is. So you have two competing ideologies, the kind of liberal tolerance and inclusiveness that, women have a place at the table with everybody else and so on, conflicting with this other ideology or this other belief, and one's triumphing over the other. Interesting.
And I think that going back to that, the parallel with creationists, like intelligent designers or so, Christian creationists, I think that there is some sincere belief among the Native Americans who put forth these rituals and these traditions and tell their creation myths. And so I'm not saying that their side, that they're lying or that they're not being sincere, but I don't understand how a educated archaeologist, a PhD, can not try to correct some of these beliefs with the people that they work with, instead of acquiescing to them. Try to correct false beliefs. I mean, I think that that's our job, to educate, and part of that education might be to challenge people's traditional beliefs. I don't think that there's anything wrong with trying to challenge that, just like I would try to challenge a student who is a creationist, a Christian creationist in my human evolution class. I personally don't see the difference.
Yes, and I presume you wouldn't object to these stories being taught, say, in a comparative mythology
No,
or
not at all.
comparative world religion class, or
Right.
Of course.
And I
mean, that has a place there.
Yeah, and I don't even have any issue with people believing what they want to believe, but it shouldn't creep into science and academic life. So, if the creation, if we look back like on the Christian creation, would we want Australopithecus afarensis, 3.2 million year old fossils reburied because some Christian creationists think that this is harmful to their view of to their worldview? And I would say no, of course we wouldn't. And I would say the same thing about the archaeology.
And you'd have unanimous support of your colleagues, I suspect.
Right.
Yeah, right. So you posted this picture on Twitter post-pandemic, and the campus reopened, and you're holding a skull of a Paleo-American or Native American fossil. I don't know how many thousands of years old that was. And you tweeted, I'm so glad to be back with my friends, or whatever it was you tweeted. It was a nice tweet, I thought. And this got you in trouble on campus. You were called a racist for holding this thing.
Yes.
Why?
So I think that it's kind of interesting, because I think that the tweet really exploded everything. But about a month earlier, or maybe 3 weeks earlier, I had gotten an op-ed published in the Mercury News, which is a big Bay Area newspaper, that spoke up against the California Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, CalNAGPRA for short, and my Twitter feed had I don't know 300, 400 comments about this op-ed, mainly negative comments, mainly calling me things like racist and colonialist and even worse, you know. And then I posted the picture. And I can't remember the exact sequence. Maybe I posted the picture first and then the op-ed came out. But it turned out what happened was when they started covering when there was started to be concern about the picture from my university and from and the Mercury News contacted me about it, interviewed me about it, and so forth. The picture still had far less attention than the op-ed in Twitter, but then it kind of flipped because people, and of course, similar people who were, or the same people who were posting negative things about the op-ed, then latched onto the picture. Now the image is me holding a skull about 3,000 years old, maybe 2,500 years old. I don't remember exactly what part of the collection that the skull came from. But basically, I was happy to be back. Literally happy to be back. I think that you can see in that picture that that's a genuine smile. And I was doing my curational duties. I was putting back samples of teeth that had the remaining of teeth that had been used for a study. So I was putting those back, and I opened up the box and I saw the skull, and I thought, wow, it's so good to be back here. And so I just took a picture. And I posted it for a couple reasons. One, I thought this is what
that's what you do.
this is what I do, and this is what makes me happy. The other thing
we all do this.
Yeah.
Social media.
And then I thought it also sends a signal to students and other researchers that the collection is back open after COVID. And one of my jobs as collections curator is to promote the use of the collection for research, to help researchers get access. Over the years, before COVID, there was likely not a single semester where I didn't help someone get access to skeletal remains for research. It's a big part of my job, but also I find that it's very important for me to help promote science, to help promote the understanding of people, and also to help launch young careers. I mean, I've really always enjoyed that, gone out of my way to ensure that this collection is available for research. So this
collection you curate, is it owned by the university?
It is.
Where did all the fossils come from?
It's actually it's actually it's a university collection. Yes, it was excavated throughout the years, but main excavation was the 60s, and it was a salvage site from Alameda County. And this is the biggest collection. We have other smaller collections in the curation facility. But the biggest collection is called the Ryan Mound, and it's about over 300 individuals, about a 2,000-year span of the collection, with the oldest ones 3,000 years to about 500 or 800 years ago, all pre-contact. And this has been a collection that has been used in literally dozens, if not maybe over 100 research, from master thesis, PhD, articles, of course my own work, but and used for everything from, people are like, well, why don't you just study the remains and then give them back? Once you're finished with that collection, give them back. And my point is, you're never finished with a collection, because a collection can be used in so many ways. And so if you look at the Ryan Mound, for example, it's been used for students who are studying forensics to understand bone preservation in a certain environment. It has been used to look at osteoarthritis patterns in comparison with Homo habilis, our, earliest in the genus Homo, because one of the early fossils of Homo habilis had arthritis on his foot. So it's been used for comparison of that since, as strange as it is, California 3,000 years ago wasn't that different from, Olduvai George 3 million years ago. It has been used to look at X-rays and growth patterns, and to reconstruct the lives of those people as well. So it's been used in so many different ways, and would be continued to be used in those ways had they not stopped providing access. And now all research on that skeletal collection is cut off. All research on any of the Native American collections cut off.
You mean not just to you, but to anybody?
Well, pretty much to anybody who asks for it. Yeah, I don't know. Since this has happened, I've had one student contact me for about questions about access, and the issue is not resolved. They've taken me out of the equation by saying that I can no longer make that decision. And they've basically said, it's only like they've literally locked me out of the curation facility. They changed the locks. I've never seen the university move so quickly on a facilities order. I mean, they literally changed the locks. And basically, they say it's because of the CalNAGPR law, but it was right after. It was literally 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the Twitter photo. The provost has sent out an email about how hurtful this photo was and how much harm, and that it doesn't align with San Jose State values. And I made a response, kind of interesting, because since I've been at San Jose State in 2004 till that photo, I've been asked multiple times to pose with skeletal remains for promotional stuff. The anthropology department promotional video for their master's program has me with skeletal remains with a smile on my face. There was nothing out of the ordinary about this photo. And so I think that it's just an excuse. It's an excuse. They know that I take a hard line against repatriation, which I've always done. As I mentioned, one of my first articles, peer-reviewed articles, was on Kennewick Man and the problems of reburying Paleo-Indians. I think, from my perspective, what happens is, I got the book out, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, co-authored with James Springer, who is a retired attorney. Yes. And it's actually on sale right now for $40 instead of $90, which includes shipping.
Gosh.
But there was a campaign to ban this book, and they won't use the word ban, but that's really what they wanted to do. They wanted to ban the book. And then they said, well, we don't really, if we can't get the book banned, we want it not available for free. So we want it out of libraries. We don't want it open access. And I think it's kind of funny that these people who want to keep other people from reading it would be Twitter messaging each other, saying, does anybody know where there's a free copy that I can get a hold of? So it's fine for them to get a free copy, but they don't want anybody who's not already made up their mind to have a free copy. So that attempt to ban the book garnered about 1,000 signatures, many of whom are anthropologists and archaeologists, some of whom are literally in my department. And I think the reason why they were so upset about the publication of the book was it was in a university press and was peer reviewed. I think then they were upset about the Society for American Archaeology talk because it wasn't a national conference, a mainstream national conference. And then I think that they were upset by the Mercury News because it was in a big newspaper, that I got a mainstream op-ed. So I think that when these waves come, it's triggered by my getting the word out in what they would think of as mainstream or academic, um, sources, and that upsets them. Um, uh, I, on the other hand, I would never want any of their books to be banned. I would want them to be open access for people, for all people. I'm I don't have any problem with people disagreeing with me. I've worked with many people who have completely different perspective on the repatriation issue as me, but I do have a problem when people start making it personal. I do have a problem when people start trying to basically, um, ruin a career. So as this was unfolding, and this comes to my lawsuit, as this was unfolding, one of the reasons why I contacted lawyers is because my dean hosted my chair at a national venue for chairs and deans. Basically, the event was what to do when your tenured colleague is branded a racist. And so I attended this open meeting. No password was required. No, it was free open meeting, public meeting on Zoom, and I attended it. And instead of saying, "Well, you support their academic freedom," what basically the answer from my chair was, "You try to make sure that they are isolated, that their resources get taken away, and if they talk about these issues in class, try to make sure to take them out of the classroom." That was what they were saying. And once I heard that, I knew I had to get legal help. And so I contacted Pacific Legal Foundation, and they've been very helpful. Although I have not been taken out of the class, there have been retaliatory actions against me, including removing me from my curation position of the collections, including keeping away non-Native American remains and data away from me for over a month, and some of them still are away from me, including not granting me access to materials that are not under NAGPRA or CalNAGPRA, like X-rays. I do a lot of X-ray research. There are a lot of X-rays of Native American in our curation facility. I've asked repeatedly for these X-rays, and they're not giving them to me. And this is all retaliatory actions. And they may say that it's because of the laws, the CalNAGPRA laws, but these followed literally within weeks of the Twitter attacks on the photo and the op-ed. And so I'm basically hoping that that this lawsuit will make them reverse the steps that they have taken.
What are you asking for in the lawsuit specifically?
I'm specifically asking for access to the remains, to have my position as curation coordinator retained, for access to the curation facility, basically assurance that there will be no more that there will be no more retaliatory actions, and that I'll be able to continue on with my job.
So you just want your life back to normal. You are tenured, so they can't fire you, right?
Yes, I'm tenured. We hope they can't fire me. So yeah, I'm tenured.
Yeah.
I'm actually a full professor, and what's quite ironic about this is when my chair talked about me, he acted like he had no idea that this was my position on repatriation, and he painted me as strange. Some of his terms were, I was not warm and fuzzy, and I'm on some kind of libertarian
What?
bent, and so he was kind of
What?
painting me as this weird, like this weirdo, right? And I even think he said that she's a strange one. Um, I don't know what that means, but basically, it's kind of setting the stage of, I had no idea, and like I had no idea that this.
But of course they had to know because
And
you've
of
been
course they
writing
did.
about this for a long
And
time.
the funny
Yeah.
thing is,
So just
sorry.
just a point of clarification. When the provost said what you said was harmful, how does harmful to who? I mean, did you hear from Native American groups in your area that said, "Hey, you holding that skull in that picture hurt my feelings," or is
Um,
this academics getting their
some
feelings hurt as a proxy for somebody else?
some Native American groups did write to the university, and some CC'd me on those, claiming harm. Um, but it's interesting that I get emails pretty much. I get emails pretty much every day from supporters, and some of those supporters are Native Americans. I would not assume that all Native Americans feel one way, just like not all
Mm.
women feel one way, or all Hispanics feel one way. So I mean, I think that there's no evidence that this is a consensus. Um, I I don't know. I think the provost letter says something like the indigenous and community and the university community. So other academics too. We've gotten to this point where we have even trigger warnings or content warnings about if there are images of skeletal remains um, in posters and so forth. Um, One of the big problems I've had with some of this is I've had some of my books they've wanted to put on display, like in conferences, like include in the back on the like the tote bag, or the what do you call the program, and they've said no, we can't do it because that has a image of of skeletal remains. And so, like, if you look at my current
This?
book, that this does not, this is considered acceptable. But my previous book, and I don't know if I have a copy of it, had a really beautiful, striking picture of a skull, and basically they said, we can't put it on we can't put it on programs or on tote bags and so forth because you know you can't show skeletal remains at an archaeology conference. I mean, this is going too far. Content warnings before slide presentations and so forth. So part of this is, and ironically, I think that if you look at social media, you'll see lots of different people holding, bioarchaeologists, archaeologists, forensic anthropologists with skeletal remains. I think that when people want to get upset about it, they will choose to get upset about it, and when they don't, they'll just ignore it. And some of the people who've been very much vocal against me a year or two ago, they themselves have pictures like that. It's I don't think it really is about the image
Right.
as opposed to
Right.
I'm not following the
No, of course
ideology.
not. No. Yeah. Yeah. Let me just read, just so our listeners understand that you are not just telling us some hyperbole here, that this is the way they really feel. Here's a review of your book. Again, the book is Repatriation in Erasing the Past from Florida, University of Florida Press. This is a review that appeared, I forget which journal. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 7 authors. And here's what they write. referring to you and your co-author James Springer, these authors explicitly refer to a 19th century traditional definition of anthropology as the guiding framework for their book. And now they're going to quote from this book, you guys. So here's you and Springer speaking. It was the traditional belief of anthropologists with which we agree that it is possible to do these sorts of studies of biological and cultural differences within a comparative, objective, and rigorous framework. Traditional anthropologists believe that they could produce an objective and universally valid body of knowledge, which is a perspective that we share. Anthropology flourished in the 20th century. Part of that flourishing, there were established museums of anthropology, or more commonly of natural history, that served as repositories for human biological and cultural remains. These museums, often associated with colleges and universities, dedicated themselves to the collection, conservation, preservation, study, and display of human biological and cultural remains. These collections were traditionally regarded as an essential part of anthropology itself and continue to be essential to anthropological studies today. Close quote from your book. Now here's the reviewers. And again, they're pulling no punches. So let's just take this as representative of what you're up against here. These words are not reflective of the current perspective of most practitioners in the field of bioarchaeology and archaeology. They stand in direct opposition to progressive relations with a number of groups, including traditionally oppressed peoples, some of whom are anthropologists, who have been consistently and repeatedly harmed by individual and institutional behavior, as well as by racist beliefs that are hegemonic in our discipline. We do not intend to amplify Weiss and Springer's book. Instead, we write this article to publicly reject the racist views that they espouse, as it is essential to recognize that there are still proponents of these antiquated and unethical views. Rather than being swept under the proverbial rug, these views must be addressed and in particular be rejected by white anthropologists. And then here's the kicker line. Repatriation and Erasing the Past, your book, is a racist book and is violent toward indigenous people. And then at the end of the review, the last sentence of the review. In the end, Weiss and Springer's argument for bioarchaeological research and non-repatriation of indigenous ancestral remains ironically fails in a catastrophic manner because of their anti-indigenous stance and their guileless contempt for cultural relativism, the benchmark of ethical perspective of the discipline of anthropology. Close quote. So anyone that thinks, oh, this is a bunch of right-wing hyperbole, you're just making this stuff up, and that academics are not really cultural relativists, there it is. They are. That's what they just said.
And it's interesting. This book has been reviewed by so many people, and almost every book review I've seen, not everyone, but a lot of them, have multiple authors. And it's like, these are not book reviews. They're not really reviewing the book. They're basically, putting their a statement against our perspective. Otherwise, they would have one reviewer because you read a book alone. But I mean, for the most part, you don't see book reviews written by 7 people. This is not a book review. I think also there's kind of this idea of cultural relativism that everything is relative, except for Western objective science. And I say in the book that objective knowledge is not Western; it's for all of humanity. But they're not viewing it as that. They think of our book really is about a return to objective knowledge, and in the sense of how we've originally thought of anthropology. Does that mean that there weren't bad things done by anthropologists 100, 200 years ago? Of course there were, but by everybody. But that doesn't mean that the idea of anthropology as it flourished was a bad idea. I would completely deny the fact that that the book is anti-Indigenous at all. I think that the best way to support any group is to try to tell the most accurate story, the best to our knowledge, what is the truth, and knowing full well that the current idea of what is true might be overturned. That's science, but basically, accepting that there is, in the end, some things are going to be correct and some things are not going to be correct, and that we can try to figure these things out. But we can't figure them out if we say, well, the way to figure them out is to ask whether somebody whether somebody is feeling spiritually harmed by our research, or I might want to publish this, but I first have to get it okayed by a tribe who is not going to okay anything that supports a migration pattern, right? So there are things like this that is just anti-science, and so I would say that the other aspect of our book, I would say, is that we take the perspective that who tells the story is not as important as how accurate that story is. So who reconstructs the past the most accurately, it doesn't matter if that person is white, black, indigenous. If they're using the best science available, the best data available, and making the best argument available, that's what matters. So just one of the things about California's law, CalNAGPRA, is that it basically says that if an indigenous leader or if a Native American says that something is true, let's say we are connected to these 5,000-year-old remains, and the skeletal and the scientific evidence says no, actually you're not, because of DNA, artifacts and craniometrics and whatever other tools are used, then the indigenous story is to be given deference to, and that basically, if there's a disagreement, it always goes to, well, the indigenous people are the right ones, even if they're not. And this is anti-science. It would not be accepted if it was Christian creationism. It would not be accepted. It should not be accepted in archaeology.
Right. Just as a counterfactual, I recall when DNA extraction from fossils was coming online and we could really trace the ancestry of people. The Mormons got very nervous about this because, they have their own origin story,
right,
about where they came from. And they said, uh-oh, because this isn't really matching our story. And they kind of went through some throes over that. And I don't know where they're at now about all that. But would your colleagues come to the defense of the Mormons and say, hey, come on. They have their origin story and we need to respect that. And it's not fair to bring modern science to bear on their origin story.
I've never experienced that. I've never seen any of my colleagues come to the defense of Mormons or Christian creationists or intelligent design creationists. So this is definitely a shift from their usual pattern.
And the reason is because of the political movement to support previously oppressed peoples, to try to right the wrong of the past.
Yes, I think that's a big part of it. And I also think it's just this kind of social identity, politics of identity movement, where there's there's kind of like queer archaeology now, and the Black Trowel Association,
what
and queer archaeology.
Oh my God, like, what is that?
It's like it's basically trying to use archaeology. Well, it's twofold. it's basically trying to use archaeology to challenge traditional gender roles or so, in the sense of looking
I see.
at,
I see.
you know, um, artifacts,
Division of labor.
right? But also, it is queer archaeologists doing archaeology. And I think that there's a danger in having people do their little pet project, what they completely identify with and so forth, because I think that that actually makes them lose objectivity. And, we would never say, well, only Englishmen can study and understand Shakespeare. So basically, I think that having outsiders look at the picture does help.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been following some related controversies. For example, Ed Wilson died a few weeks ago, I guess last month now. E.O. Wilson. And, the moment he's dead, when he can't explain himself, these articles start coming out, his secret racist past promoting racial science and so on. First of all, there wasn't anything secret about it. It was a huge movement in the 70s and 80s. Science for the People, led by Steve Gould and Dick Lewontin at Harvard, in his own building, kind of rose up against him, and implying that this was, a step back to the eugenical movement of the early 20th century, and or even worse in the 19th century, and now he's scientifically he's largely won that battle. I mean, the evolutionary psychology study of humans is a robust field, and the early critiques by Gould, for example, on these people telling just so stories. Okay, so there was some sloppiness in that kind of research, but that's been largely corrected now. That's how science works. You keep improving. And as long as the critics are free to criticize and be skeptical, and then you can respond, that's what the whole open peer commentary and review is all about, right? So, but what disturbs me about this is, they kind of waited till he was dead, where he couldn't explain this connection he had with Philippe Rushton. I don't know if you know the whole J. Philippe Rushton story.
Yeah,
out there.
I was married to Phil for 3 years. We had a
What?
Yeah, yeah. I was married to Phil Rushton for 3
what?
years. We
Oh my God! I had
yes,
no
we
idea.
met at a HBES conference. We had a relationship
Right.
for a couple years beforehand. We were married for 3 years. So yes, I know the Phil Rushton very well.
So, well, then you tell me. Then, okay, this is a great opportunity. What's the story there? What's the insight? What's his connection with Wilson? Why did Wilson offer his support, at least behind the scenes?
I mean, I went to many conferences with Phil. Met E.O. Wilson several times. It was always very friendly. I don't know like their correspondence or so forth. I mean, but I thought they were professionally friendly to each other, and kind of I would say kind of like along the lines of some of the other colleagues that other professors and colleagues that Phil had, like Art Jensen, for example, Linda Gottfredson. Some of them he was closer with than others. So, like, some of kind of interesting because Phil and I divorced I think in 2003, and it was not a pleasant divorce, but it was not for people like, oh, did you divorce him because he was a racist? And my simple answer is he wasn't a racist. Just because you study race differences doesn't make you a racist. And I divorced him because of personal reasons, like most divorces. But so I don't know all the ins and outs of the details of his research. I'm not an IQ researcher, so there were things that I obviously read, and I proofread some of his works and so forth. But when people are like, oh well, why don't we talk about the G factor or so, and I'm like, well, that's not my area of expertise. I do know a little bit about it because I was and conferences and so forth. But I'm not a evolutionary psychologist. I'm not an IQ researcher. But like,
When you when,
Phil,
when you say he was not a racist, you mean so in all the years you were together, in intimate moments you're living together, he never dropped a line like, "Oh, those blacks are this," or "Asians are like that," or just kind of
no,
have a few
no,
drinks and just spill out what you're really thinking. There was nothing like that.
no. And I never saw him treat somebody poorly because they were black, or I never saw him like I never heard of him treating somebody poorly because of their race. Um, I yeah, I he had he studied race differences and he drew conclusions about that many of those differences were based in genetics. But I think that Phil um, he was basically in everyday life, he was like people are treated as individuals. And it's the same thing like
Hmm.
if I study sex differences now, does that make me a sexist? Just because I think that sex differences are biological. Um, I don't see it that way. So I never
Yeah.
experienced Phil saying anything like, like what I would consider a racist. His favorite actor was Denzel Washington. I mean, like,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
it's not. Had no problems about mixed race couples. I mean, like all these kinds of things that you would expect from a racist. He wasn't like that. So,
Interesting. Yeah. That's the sense I get too from Charles Murray, who I know a little bit and have engaged with at conferences. And I don't get the sense that he's a racist. But there is this question: why the focus on race differences in IQ? That's a pretty radioactive topic in science. I wouldn't touch it. And I'm always curious why other people dive right into it. And maybe it's intellectual curiosity. Of course, you always wonder: is there something else? You're telling me not the case with Rushton. For our listeners, just to kind of give the bigger picture here, he had more than just kind of a hereditarian view of race differences in IQ, with Asians at top and whites in the middle and blacks in the bottom. Okay, he also had this in the connection with Wilson. Ed Wilson developed this theory about R selection and K selection. R selected species have many, many offspring, think salmon, in hopes of getting just a few into the next generation. And K selected species have just a handful or very few offspring and devote enormous resources to them to get them into the next generation. And that there's different ways to get your genes in the next generation. That's sort of the point. So, as far as I understand, if I recall from the 90s when all this was unfolding, Rushton took that and applied it to human group differences, that blacks are more like R selected, rapid breeding, having many offspring, don't put as many resources into each one, versus white versus Asian, and so forth. Then he also had something about penis length. I forget what the connection was with IQ and this R selection, K selection, but he had, remember, it's kind of weird. He had data from condom companies about average penis sizes. Anyway, I thought, oh boy, he's out there with this stuff, and it was very controversial. Now the stuff that's coming out now about Ed Wilson is that there's a box of letters that only a handful of people have seen, and it's just come out after he died, so he can't explain himself, where Rushton was under pretty extreme attacks. If I recall, he didn't have tenure at the time. And people were blocking his classes, blocking his office, protesting him in the hallways and on the campus itself, death threats. And I think my sense was that Wilson felt himself sympathetic because he had been attacked, not quite that viciously, but he famously had a cup of water poured over his head at a evolution conference, a science conference, in which they yelled, "Wilson, you're all washed up," and for the sociobiology stuff. So my sense is that he was a little sympathetic about academic freedom being taken away from Phil Rushton, and and not that he was supporting race science or anything like that. And now you're telling me Rushton himself probably wasn't a racist. Okay, I didn't know him, so I take it you better than anyone I think alive at the moment could say what he was really like in private. And since you had a unamicable divorce, you would be willing to say what he really thought if he really said something. And you're telling me he didn't. Okay. So then what do we make of that? Well, maybe there's just some people interested in those kinds of questions and they want to pursue it. I wouldn't do that. But I should note parenthetically, this is a whole nother subject, but I had Richard Nisbett on the podcast, and I just said, just walk us through what's wrong with the Murray and Ernstein's bell curve argument, and why is it not why are these group differences not primarily explained by heredity? And he explained it. I thought he made a very good argument against the hereditarian view, and that's my view. But still, the secondary question is this academic freedom. Anyway, I'm just kind of riffing on that now.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I even agree with the whole hereditary aspect of many things. I'm kind of on the fence on that. I know my brother's an evolutionary psychologist, and like there's some things.
Who's your brother?
Alex Weiss at the University of Edinburgh.
Oh, okay.
And
okay,
so there's some things that he'll say, oh, that's genetic or mainly genetic and so forth, and I'll be like, So I'm not. I don't think that it's about necessarily agreeing with everything. I think that it's more about trying to figure it out. And I don't know why Phil hooked on to this and really didn't let it go. But I do know Phil was very stubborn. And I can just imagine that. And I met him after much of the big kerfluffle, right? So I met him in 97, I believe. And I can just imagine that once he did one and there was a big, attack on it, that made him dig in his heels more because he was a very stubborn person. And, so I think that he and I have that in common, that I can be quite stubborn when it comes to that. That's, I think that that's probably one of the reasons why he stuck with it. So, yeah, I don't know if everything that he came up with was accurate. I do think that he had a real love of science. He had a real love of trying to figure things out. And that if certain things turned out not to be true, then I think that that was basically how science progresses. Sometimes you think you've got something figured out and it turns out not to be true. More data, more refined evidence, more analysis of the same data. But Phil definitely, he had a great love of science, and he also had he really was a proponent of trying to get young researchers started, and he was a very very complicated person in many ways, but he was also just very interested in trying to understand the world around him.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this was the argument James Flynn made. He of the eponymous Flynn effect. IQ scores are going up about 3 points every decade for the past almost century. And by the way, that title, the Flynn effect, was created by Ernstein and Murray in the bell curve. Okay, but Flynn's argument is non-hereditarian. It's entirely culture. There's not enough. A few decades, not enough for evolution to be working. This is a cultural shift in abstract reasoning, because living in an agricultural society versus industrial society versus digital society is going to retrain the brain to think more abstractly, and that's why IQ points in the abstract reasoning portion of the IQ test are going up the most. and not so much on the other portions of the IQ test. Anyway, but Flynn's larger effect was that larger argument was that the only way to know why Murray is wrong and Rushton are wrong about their hereditary views of IQ is to study their arguments and publish their papers and submit them to peer review and open debate. And he said, I welcome it because that's how I found out why they're wrong. I figured out why they're wrong, and here's why I think they're wrong. If you had censored those papers or said, well, you can't do that, we wouldn't know why they're wrong.
And isn't it ironic that Flynn's last book was basically pulled from the publisher, his first publisher, and it was about censorship. It was about censorship in academia, and then it was pulled
Totally
from publication.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're going through some really difficult times culturally, I think. And I try to understand why, some of these things happen. There's some of the kind of recency effect and availability heuristic, that you see these, police killings of blacks on the news of these viral videos, and it's terrible to watch. It's horrific. It's infuriating. I get it. And so here's one explanation I have is that most of us can't do anything about these things, right? This racist cop and he kills this black. What am I going to do? I'm not a policeman. I'm not the chief of police. I'm not a mayor of the local city where this happened, and I can get out there and make some changes. I can't do anything. Well, I can go march, or I can go on social media and say defund the police, and I'm angry. And I think a lot of people feel like I can't do anything, and I want to do something. Damn it, so I'm going to go after Elizabeth Weiss and her, racist views that she put forward in this book. Because what else are they going to do? They're not archaeologists. They don't know anything about the whole problem here that you're engaged in. And so it's like, I want to do something. And so sometimes I think it's just that. It's just people want to speak out and kind of vent their moral, outrageous kind of sense that they have about some of the wrongs that are still around. And some of the wrongs that are in the past. And, that was then, and this is now, things are better. That doesn't feel good. It feels like I want to engage. Things are still bad, and I'm pissed, and I'm going to do something about it.
I think there is some of that. I would say that there's also the fact that it is quite easy to post something on social media. So you just get a lot of a lot more reactions. I also think that more often people are more likely to complain than to congratulate. I find that that's a little bit of human nature. Just like if you look at reviews, like Yelp reviews, right? You get like a lot of people who are complaining about whatever experience they have. I also think that there is an agenda. I do think that archaeologists, bioarchaeologists, and anthropologists do have an agenda, and that agenda is to basically take the science out of archaeology and make it more of a social justice field. I don't know why they started this. If archaeologists had wanted to become social justice activists, there are other fields that they could have gone into, like political science. I think that there's kind of a movement of if you're studying the past and you're not looking at the wrongs of the past, then you're doing and how to correct that, then you're doing something wrong. And I think that there has to be more of a tolerance of that. There's going to be different types of questions asked and different types of perspectives, and that if somebody wants to look at, skeletal remains in a political view to try to right past wrongs, that's fine. But they should also accept that some people are just going to want to look at skeletal remains to determine what people ate in the past, for example. I don't think that we should make everything political. I think that there's a danger in losing a lot of knowledge if everything is filtered through a political lens. And repatriation is a huge, is like the poster child of this. When they start filtering, um, archaeology, skeletal remains, and artifacts through a political lens, basically the conclusion is we got to get rid of these remains and rebury them, and that will end archaeology. And there's people will say, well, why don't you scan the bones and then create 3D images of the bone, 3D models of the bones, and then that will save archaeology. Oh, one thing is I don't think the technology is quite there yet, in the sense that it's not cost effective or fast. But the other thing is, even if the technology were to be there, I guarantee that they would basically start requesting that those models of bones would be removed. And I remember years ago when I was in the Canadian Museum of Civilization, the curator of the museum at the time, he had received a letter from a Native American group, and basically they had requested the casts of bones that he had made, and their plans were to destroy those casts. So this is there. If people think, oh, it will end once the remains are reburied, they're wrong. It won't end there. Just like, and in some ways, that's where I think anthropologists and archaeologists really took a misstep. When NAGPRA, when the first repatriation laws were passed, they thought, oh, well, only affiliated remains, affiliated with modern tribes remains, will get repatriated and reburied, and unaffiliated ones will still be able to study. But once it was determined that there were many of the remains were unaffiliated, they basically changed the definition of what was affiliated and said, well, all what you need now is geography, right? So just location. It doesn't stop. It doesn't stop until basically the science is taken away and there's just the ideology, just a ideology of cultural relativism, except when it comes to Western culture, replaced. So,
Yeah, I suppose that would be cultural appropriation if you made casts of bones of some other people. Is there also a sense that only Native American archaeologists should study Native Americans?
yes, that is definitely one of the movements that Native Americans should only study Native Americans, that they should be the only ones to tell the stories. And actually, the our university had a webinar. San Jose State had a webinar on how to create a Native American center, and two of the speakers were were basically putting forth that argument. One of them said that no non-Native Americans should be working at the center, not even as secretaries, because if there's for example, if there is a Hispanic individual working at the center, they may be mistaken for Native American, and that would be insulting to Native Americans. And they may mistake a Native American for Hispanic, and that would be insulting to the Native Americans. I don't understand why it would be insulting. It's just like if you take a look at me and you think, "Oh, are you Irish?" And I'm like, "No, actually, there's no Irish in my family. It's Romanian German." And people would be like, it's not a big deal because I don't think I'm better than the Irish. But obviously, if you find it insulting to be misidentified, then you think that those people are not as good as you. That's the only conclusion I can draw from that. And then they went on to say that only Native Americans should be able to teach Native American studies courses. Well, this is the same, going back, this is the same as saying that only British people should be able to teach Shakespeare. And I think that is a movement that they want to put forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that identity politics, group inclusiveness or groupness is everything. It's like the Whoopi Goldberg controversy last week. She to me, it wasn't that she was wrong so much. I mean, the Jews are not a race in the biological sense, and they're black Jews, and there's Jews in all races. You just convert. You don't have to be born into it. But I think she was reflecting the larger point that race is skin color. That's what race means. Not what it meant to the Nazis.
No.
And, Europeans, they didn't think of race in that way at all. So it's not that she was wrong so much as that she's reflecting what a 2020 to 2022 say understanding of race in America, and that's what that means. And the way she was treated, she has to be off for 2 weeks to think about what she did. It's just embarrassing that we respond to an adult like that. You go stand in the corner with your dunce cap on and repeat, how bad you were, and it's it's just this kind of pile-on effect. It's really bothersome. I mean, just the Joe Rogan thing. I was writing about that, and I know Joe. He's not a racist. He's just not. And to think that this Media Matters company, I think, that released the N-word tape, they just had somebody watch 10,000 hours of Joe Rogan podcast to try to catch him on something. Let's see if we can get him. Yeah. What kind of world is that? I mean, he used the N clearly. It's just I'm just ranting.
I've met Joe Rogan a couple times, and he always came across to me as somebody who is very open, very funny, and it's not. Again, even if somebody's wrong about something or has a different perspective, it doesn't mean that they should be shut down. And that's I think one of the messages, and that I'm trying to get across as well in my lawsuit, is that I'm not requiring or expecting anybody in my university to agree with my perspective, but for them to paint it as I hid my perspective and I should be punished or retaliated against, is just incorrect and is just inappropriate.
Yeah, there's a sense that it's not just that we disagree with you and we want to point out why you're wrong. We want you to lose your job. You can't do what you're doing anymore. And we're not going to be satisfied until you are utterly destroyed.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, come on. Where is that coming from? That's that deep moral outrage people have, and they want to strike out against other people.
And I know many archaeologists who are very frightened to speak out against this repatriation ideology, against this movement in archaeology to rebury remains and artifacts and control the research. And many of them are just scared to speak out. And some of them who have spoken out have gotten death threats. So I understand their fear. I don't know why I'm not afraid. I guess it's but I'm not, and I'm not worried about what will come, because I think that when you know that you're doing the right thing, and I do think that speaking up for academic freedom and for my freedom to hold a different perspective is the right thing, and somebody has to do that. That I'm not, whatever happens will happen, and I hope for the best, but I'm prepared for anything.
You are. So you filed a lawsuit, and they've been served, and has this university issued a statement of any kind?
No, they have not issued a statement.
Anything?
They're not saying anything.
Yeah, they probably won't. So do you know, will it go to trial, or do you think they'll, I don't know, settle? There's nothing to settle. You're not asking for money, right?
I'm not asking for money. I think there's that there is a small statement about nominal fees. Basically, if we win, they'd pay the Pacific Legal Foundation who do pro bono.
Right,
but
right.
I'm not asking for personal money. I don't know what will happen. I don't know if it will go to court or not. I'm not sure how they, you know, how they could settle it. So it's just hard for me to say what will come next. Um, I think that it's just a wait and see.
Yeah. What is your sense about the political orientation of the field of archaeology? Does it match those global surveys we see of, academic professors that, 70%, 80% in the social sciences lean left or they vote Democrat? I think in the humanities, it's like 90% or 95%. I hadn't really thought about archaeology. My guess is that it's in that range,
It is.
probably along with anthropology and English lit and humanities.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there is a I think that it used to be less so because there was a lot of people who went into field work for the it's kind of an intellectual endeavor that's also very hands-on, and so you got like kind of a slightly different type of academic sometimes. But I think that it's very
Indiana Jones kind.
Yeah. But I think that that is not so much the case anymore.
Yeah, that seems to be across the board. It remains to be seen what the cause of this is. Probably in decades hence, there'll be a historian who writes the history of this period, maybe starting in the 1960s through now, say 1920 or 2020. What happened? The Vietnam War and Watergate, and I don't know what trends a historian might dig out of this kind of leftward shift, but it's going to be something deeper, I think, going on. This ideology behind. It's not just about the bones that you're dealing with. There's something much deeper there.
And I think that that's an important point, that we try to make in Repatriation and Erasing the Past, that it's not just about the bones. It is kind of a postmodern movement, cultural relativism, that the person who tells the story is more important than whether the story is accurate. These are all kind of trends in anthropology, archaeology, that has led to this. We include in Repatriation and Erasing the Past the case against the geneticists at Stanford and the University of Arizona, I believe, with the Havasupai, which are the Grand Canyon Native American tribe, and they gave blood and samples and palm prints, and they claimed that that the research that was done using this evidence was causing them great harm because it looked at schizophrenia, inbreeding, migration, peopling of the Americas. And they said that they only accepted to give blood for diabetes research. Now it's interesting that the informed consent that they signed actually says, and other medical biology and medical studies. So they were informed. The consent did allow for other studies, but nevertheless, the university settled. Basically, there was a cash settlement that instead of going to court. It would have been interesting if it had gone to court to see what the outcome was. But it's this kind of, it's not just the bones, it's about DNA, it's about the control. It's a lot about control over what is asked. And then if they don't like the answers, then they don't want those answers told. So I think that that's another aspect of it.
Yeah, it reminds me of the whole reparations movement. If anybody has a claim to reparations from the United States besides blacks, it would be Native Americans. We took a lot of land, the United States government. And the Louisiana Purchase, it wasn't Napoleon's land to sell. It wasn't Jefferson's land to buy, but whose was it? Well, it was, I don't know, 600 Native American tribes that occupied all that territory. And, but they took it from somebody that, lived 1,000 years before them. And those people took it from the people that lived before them and so on. And you look at those grave sites.
But they were also taking it from each other constantly. I mean, there was constant tribal warfare. There's tons of evidence of skeletal evidence of obsidian arrowheads and bones, of cranial depressions from fights, broken noses, evidence of cannibalism. So they were taking land from each other as well. I don't think that they really had a concept of land ownership. And so I think it's kind of hard to say that the land was stolen, because in order for it to be stolen, it had to have been owned. And I'm not sure that they had this concept of land ownership. Unfortunately, they didn't have written documents, and so we don't know. But had they had written documents and they had deeds, it probably wouldn't have been so easy to take the land. But even in the Ryan Mound collection that I studied, two of my last articles on the collection, one was about a bump on the head that was from trauma, but the other one was about biological continuity over these 2,000 years, and it showed that there were invasions into the site area at various times, and that those migrations could be considered invasions because they were coupled with evidence of violence. So it's kind of this image of, we have kind of sometimes this image of them all living on the land peacefully, and they have their spot, and that's where they stayed. But that's not how it happened. And this is another case of, the most accurate picture is not the picture that they want shown. And that would be, there's been several researchers that basically couldn't get their research published because it showed evidence of violence, and the Native Americans who they had to get the okay from said, no. So that's another aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, I've written quite a bit about this subject of to what extent our ancestors were violent, and I agree with Pinker in his, Better Angels of Our Nature book, which summarizes, all that research for the last quarter century or so, showing these grave sites with, a large percentage of the people who died violently, especially males, way, way higher than the worst inner city violence you can think of in the modern world. And, there's been pushback against that, the noble savage argument, that kind of blank slate. No, they weren't like that. They were, these were the beautiful people. They were, living in harmony with their environment and so on. But, Native Americans denuded forests long before Europeans arrived, and, they fought each other, and, it's human nature. We have inner demons that come out. And if you don't have some kind of state to quell those inner demons through laws and police and so on, well, let me grab a book here for a second. So I had on the show a few months ago David Wengrow. I don't know if you've seen this book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. I don't know if you've read this yet.
No, I haven't, but I have it on my list of things to read.
You haven't read it yet? Yeah, I would be curious to know what archaeologists think of this, because their argument is not that everything I just said is incorrect, although they do push back against Pinker in the opening chapter pretty strongly, saying that he kind of overplays that data set, that there are other data sets that show other groups who are not like that. Okay, maybe. And that there are multiple ways that our early ancestors, here they're talking like maybe, say, 100,000 years to 10,000 years ago, that show they weren't all violent. It wasn't a Hobbesian world of, war of all against all and so forth. And it's it's a thick book. So
Mm.
they make a pretty good case that at the very least there were many ways that humans found to live, different political systems, economic systems that weren't all like what we've been talking about here. Anyway, I'll be curious to know what professionals that work in those specific data sets that they're addressing here think about their claims that that particular site there was not a violent site. Those people weren't violent. Somehow they managed to figure out how to resolve human conflict without a top-down hierarchical state like strongman, a chiefdom, or a state, something like that. Okay,
Yeah.
maybe, but I don't know that much
And of
about the
course, there's going to
Yucatan.
be variation. But what it's interesting, a lot of times we think of violence in the past being connected to a lack of resources, and obviously that will, be an issue. If there's lack of resources, you're fighting for those resources. But even in places where there should have been an abundance of resources, like the Bay Area, like your part of the town, right, Santa Barbara, there was actually quite a lot of violence, and anthropologist by the name of Philip Walker, who's passed away, he I think was one of the first to document the violence in Southern California and trophy taking and so forth. And it was quite surprising how much there was. I suspect that for every skeletal remain that you find evidence of violence, there were others who the evidence of violence is not there. If I kill you in a way that doesn't affect your skeletal remains, it's not going to be evidence of violence on the skeletal remains. So, if anything, it's likely underestimated and not overestimated. It's just like we call this the osteological paradox. If you find a skeleton that looks completely healthy and good, and you're like, wow, this person had a great life, and yet that person's dead and probably died young, the disease just didn't affect the bones yet. And so you can't really say that they were healthy. You can just say you don't have evidence that they weren't healthy or injured or so forth. So I think that that's
right.
an important aspect to realize that not every injury is going to affect the bones. Most of them won't. Just like not every disease will affect the bones. Most of them won't.
Right. So people centuries ago didn't get Alzheimer's because they didn't live long enough to get Alzheimer's.
And even if they had it, we wouldn't know it because it's not it doesn't affect the skull. It affects the brain instead. So, it's
Still, I'm impressed with what you guys could do with bones. It is remarkable. Like the tartar on the teeth, you can scrape off and see what they were eating or whatever. It's like,
oh, yeah.
Okay, wow.
I think that one of the things that people don't realize is because so many lay people are kind of focused on the DNA, and which is really exciting. I'm not against it, obviously, but there's so many other things that we can learn from skeletal remains. Like you mentioned, the diet. We can determine when children were weaned by looking at the bone chemistry. You can look at growth patterns. You can see whether there were periods of time in the child's life where they were under so much stress that they stopped growing with X-rays and with bands on the teeth. We can see if they had anemia. Just there's indicators of vitamin C deficiency that you can look at. And of course, rickets with vitamin D deficiency. So many health indicators. But also, the cultural things that are really interesting, like trephination, like the cutting a hole in the skull. And one of the skeletal collection that I'm starting to look at now, since it's not Native American, and they finally have granted me access to this skeletal collection that is from Carthage, and it's like it's the first time I saw an actual, as opposed to a model, surgery on the skull, and one individual even had their nasal area cut out probably to relieve sinus stresses. One individual had
Mm.
a filed down goat tooth to replace a missing tooth. I mean, these things are
Oh my God.
fascinating. It
Whoa.
tells a story about
Whoa.
people that we just, that really brings them back to life in a sense that, we can imagine what their lives were like.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what does that have to do with the current politics? Nothing.
Nothing,
So
exactly.
why
And
is
not everything
identity
has,
politics getting into this?
yeah, and
Yeah.
not everything has to be political.
I remember the controversy of the 90s over that book, Black Athena. Bernal, I think was the author's
Hmm.
name. Bernal, last name. I forget the first name. And Mary Lefkowitz did a review for us in Skeptic. She's a classicist. And her overall take was the book was suggesting that the ancient Greeks went to Egypt and they got what we call Western philosophy and logic and rationality and science and so forth from them. And so is really in Egypt's in Africa. So it's really black philosophy, logic. In other words, blacks get the credit for Western civilization, something like. I'm oversimplifying, but that was the idea. And Mary Lefkowitz's point was only a 1990s American would ask, what color were the Egyptians?
Yeah.
Were they black? Were they, what is, that's a very American thing to focus. The Egyptians would not have been obsessed about skin color and race and all that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And just
But here
so
we
much
are.
other things that's so many other things to ask that, to reconstruct the past. And we need the skeletal remains to do so.
Yeah. Well, I hope you win your battle.
Thank
I
you.
do think it's the right thing to do to push back. It's not trivial to call somebody a racist in the modern world. This is this could be career ending. I was just reading this latest article on Ed Wilson, in the New York Review of Books, in which the author said, "Look, we don't think he should be canceled or anything like that. We're just telling you we think he was a racist and he was promoting race science." Oh yeah, that's not going to get you canceled or anything. No,
Yeah.
no. It's just a little thing you just toss out there as one does. No, that's huge. That's pretty defamatory
Yeah, it is.
and harmful. Speaking of
Yeah.
harm, if we're going to be concerned about people being harmed, well, okay. How about the reverse?
Yeah. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much
So,
for talking to me.
yes, no, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And thanks for sharing that about Philippe Rushton. That I don't think anyone has that insight. That's very, very interesting. Well, we're living in interesting times for sure. All right, Elizabeth. Well, when this all gets settled, let me know, and we'll come on and do a post mortem about it all.
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.